Hello and welcome to this episode of Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward and I'm exploring the coast of Essex on this podcast, finding out about and hearing the amazing stories from this diverse part of the world. Before meeting my guest, thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, please tell your friends and encourage them to listen and subscribe. You can also like the Essex by the Sea page on Facebook and Instagram and follow Twitter as well. In this episode, just like The Little Mermaid, we go under the sea. That's because buried under the silt of the River Thames lies a treasure trove of a shipwreck. I'm in Leigh-on-Sea for this episode, and joining me in the Old Town is Steve Ellis from the London Shipwreck Trust. Steve, thanks ever so much for joining me.
No worries.
Now, listeners may be familiar with the Mary Rose, but not the London. What's special about this particular ship?
The Mary Rose was, everyone knows the Mary Rose has been Henry VIII's ship. Well, the London was built under Cromwell. It's a Cromwellian-built ship, and it brought King Charles back for his restoration. It's part of a convoy with Prince of Wales on board the London at the time, and it was a flagship as well for Sir John Lawson.
So how did it end up being at the bottom of the Thames over, 360 years ago?
It was in preparation for the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and it was coming out of Chatham, and it was going up the estuary to receive its captain, but accidentally exploded, killing over 300 people on board at the time. And
sunk to the bottom, almost never to be seen again.
When it did go down a few years later, because the bronze cannon was very valuable, they did try to salvage some of her cannons, and it was mentioned in Samuel Pepys' diary that it's broken all in, and the sad loss of London, it's broken all in pieces. So they did try to attempt to salvage the cannons off it at the time. It was partly forgotten about until the London Borough Ports started investigating the site for the dredging works, when it came to light again.
Now, it's a race against time, though, because I've seen reports that it's literally being washed away. Is that right?
Definitely. Every dive we're making new discoveries, because with all these ultra-large vessels coming and going in the estuary, it's having a detrimental effect on the wreck. It's churning all the silt up, and we just keep coming across new discoveries every dive. And it's just a shame because everything's being washed away in the currents.
How regularly are you diving on the wreck?
We try to get out mostly each week, really. In times we don't really dive, although we did dive this year is January, because sometimes it's bitterly cold, but even this year we dived a site in January.
Now, it's out in the estuary. You've mentioned about the big boats and the big ships. I mean, obviously the Thames has had to be dredged to accommodate them. Is it the dredging, or is it the passing ships that's causing this, or is it just the tide?
It was both. Well, it's all three.
Yeah.
Because it's right on the edge of a main channel, and it actually sits in a secondary channel, so we do have ships go over the top of it. Thankfully not when we're out on the site, but we have a fantastic cooperation by the Port of London. We have a special permit from them where they slow the ships down for us. But it is the huge container ships were actually going past now, which is actually eroding the silt off.
Now, the Thames isn't exactly the sort of clearest of waters to dive in, this is not sort of coral reefs and crystal clear blue sea. It must be quite a challenge for every dive that you do.
It is. We've got hardcore dive instructor friends, and they think we're actually bonkers for what we do. But it's something we're used to. We dive it every week. We're used to the conditions. Even yesterday's dive, the visibility was literally about 6 inches, so you have your mast right up to the wreck to actually to see or mostly feel around the wreck. But we know, it's safe to say we know the wreck inside and out. We've probably spent more time on it than what the actual crew. So we do know our way around us out, even in poor visibility or zero visibility. Once you go past 6 metres, there's no ambient light at all. If you turn your torch off, it is literally pitch black. I mean, pitch black. It's, more like a black hole. You just can't see anything. The
Thames Estuary is quite deep. We're standing here in Leigh, and the tide is coming in at a a rapid rate of knots. Actually, it's flowing in quite a bit, and just here the depth is quite large. I mean, how deep is the shipwreck out there?
The London lays in 18 metres of water, but it's the currents. We generally dive an hour before high water while the currents are slackening off, but it takes all our effort to pull ourselves down the anchor line just to get to the site, and I mean it is a real effort to pull ourselves down to the bottom.
And when you are at the bottom and obviously working on the site, what are you doing? Are you surveying? Are you salvaging? Making records of what is there before it goes?
No, definitely not salvaging, because we are archaeologists minded. We record and monitor as much information as we can. I've always wanted to be an archaeologist, and I just love the Thames Estuary. I think it's so many wrecks. And my uncle used to be a Southend fisherman, so when I was a child, I used to sit in his dining room and he'd get his charts out, and I used to love listening to the stories or his knowledge about the wrecks. And it was a chance meeting with a professor at an airport departure gate on a visit to one of the sites. He mentioned Vista Historic England, and they invited me to become the licensee of the London. And right from our very first dive, we was making discoveries on it, what was all completely new discoveries, and since then trying to record as much information, because there is little known about what was actually left of the London.
There is so much of the history of the London that's clearly missing from after it going down to more recent times and the work that you and others are doing. You've already found, or certainly some bits have been recovered from the wreck and have been shown in the Southend Museum as well, haven't they?
We realised we was losing all artefacts on it. One dive they're there, next dive they're gone, and this was crazy. I thought, why should we be anyone seeing it? So Historic England at the time was sympathetic to our concerns, and they gave us a licence to recover the stuff, which, with Southend Museum, the receiving museum, which was brilliant, because I did ask whether the finds could stay local. But we've also got a display cabinet in new galleries in a National Maritime Museum with all our finds in it, which I'm pretty proud of.
And what sort of things have you found then and been able to recover that's now on display?
Well, I'm not allowed to recover anything at the moment because sadly there's no funds for conservation, but I have in the past recovered some beautiful navigation equipment, leather shoes, complete leather shoes with still their laces and stitches. I think they're 350 years old. And one of my finds was a small sundial pocket compass. To me, that would have been a rotary watch. At the time, it certainly would have been from one of the officers on board. Also, lovely glass globe and shaft bottles, complete. That's the thing with the Thames. What makes visibility really bad is the silt, but when things are actually buried in a silt, they're actually like brand new. But when they get exposed, or as the ship's eroding, they don't last within weeks, they just deteriorate.
How large is this ship and sort of the site? Sort of artefacts sort of scattered around? Is it all sort of fairly self-contained?
No, the site is in... There's two parts of the wreck, and they're 400 metres apart. There's a lot still buried under the silt. When I tried to put my survey control points in spikes with reference numbers on, so I know as I'm surveying the site, you can't put them actually into the silt because you're feeling the wreck around. So there's still a lot of the wreck still buried under the silt. But what I believe is we've got from the main gun decks down to the keel is left. It's like the mirror slightly on its side. But the thing is, most of the finds we was coming across, like sadly even human remains were coming from the gun decks, where obviously the people would have been on board at the time. And we've got the stores below the gun decks of like complete barrels. We had stacks of shoes, everything they needed on board to be, fully ready for the conflict they were proceeding.
So that's the thing, this isn't an empty ship, is it? It was loaded to the gunwales, ready to go off to war.
Exactly, and this is what makes it such an important time capsule. Well, most wrecks, if they've come ashore or hulks, have been stripped. But this one, because it exploded and it hasn't been dived on, we've still got so much in situ. But the thing is, it's a sad that we are seeing it erode. It's like having a cake and it's sliced from the top to the bottom. Every dive, that piece of silt is coming away. So we're discovering new bits all the time.
And these big ships, I'm just looking out now, it's low tide, so there's none actually in sight. But actually, just the other day, we had one of the world's largest ships offloading at DP World at London Gateway, just along the Thames. I mean, when you're diving and these large container ships are going overhead almost, it must be quite frightening, isn't it?
When we first dived the site, you could hear the approaching ships, and one of the divers we took out, he said it was like the reverberations of the propellers was like being hit by a cricket bat. Well, my wife would say that she would tend to duck, while I would tend to look up, but there's no point because you can see above your head anyway. But now we just get so used to it. When we look back at our video films, you can see us measuring the site from going past, and we don't even think anything of it now. But I suppose to a diver what's never dived a site and anyone comes past, it must be quite hairy, really. What was interesting, we had the world's largest container ship come past us on one of our dives a few months ago, and it actually took all the silts off the gun decks off, and you could see complete pristine timbers. Then at the end of the dive, another big MSC container ship gone past, and it covered this wreck back up. So that's the effect these ships have on the site. One of our dives, when a ship came past, it actually felt like we was being dragged off the wreck. Me and my wife had to hold on to the wreck to just stay where we was, because it did feel like we was being dragged off into the main channel.
What's the plans then for the Trust in terms of documenting and recording and taking the story of the London forward?
The plans of the Trust is to try to make people aware of it, because for a nationally important wreck, even the local people don't really know about it, and it's just trying to raise awareness, because some of our finds, along with the Nautical Archaeology Society who've got the Save the London campaign, we're trying to raise money to actually pay for the conservation of the finds. I did recover, which I didn't have a licence for, was a complete shoe, and we know for a fact on the next dive that would be completely gone. And I did sort of, raise a case that if I wasn't to recover it at the time, there's no way it would have been left there. We found out it was a different style of shoe than what I'd already recovered, and it was the latest fashion shoe. So we can't just leave artefacts. It's better to recover them, record them, and if they want it burnt or whatever, destroy it. But it's better to have a record or something than nothing. So the whole idea with the Trust is to try to raise funds, along with the Nautical Archaeology Society, to save the London.
Where can people find out more about the London?
We have our Facebook page, the London Shipwreck Trust, where we keep a running diary. We do a Twitter feed, and we have got a website with the London.
On your next dive, what are you hoping to find then?
You just don't know. The excitement is, the anticipation is, you don't know. We know where we're working, you know what part of a ship we're on, so you know roughly what you didn't find. I do like all the personal finds, because it brings the story of the people on board. I did have one fantastic dive. For about 10 minutes of the dive, everything goes dead still. The silt drops out of the water, and it was a Sunday morning, perfectly still, and I was at another gun carriage I've discovered. I was going along the gun decks, pristine gun decks, all the grains, all the markings of where the sailors had marked the gun decks, all the gunners' implements. I could see out of the gun port, go towards the ship's cable, and I thought, this was just, I'm really privileged to be able to do this on a 17th century British warship. It's just fantastic.
Steve, thank you ever so much for joining me on this episode of Essex by the Sea.
No problem at all.
Next time on Essex by the Sea.
So from the age of about 9 years old, lots of young people have actually been on board. They've been on board for a multi-activity day where they'll do some sailing on Pioneer, they'll do some trawling, they might do a beach scavenger hunt, they'll learn a little bit about history, and they'll also get introduced to our yard and what we do here, and introduced to the idea that apprenticeships in boat building exist.
So make sure you subscribe in the same place as you found this episode so that you don't miss it. An episode will land on the 1st and 15th of each month. So until next time, thanks for listening.